Buried beneath the Sahara sands lie the ruins of empires that once controlled the world's gold and rivaled the might of Rome. From the lush days of a green desert to the scholarly halls of Timbuktu, discover the dramatic rise and fall of West Africa's greatest superpowers. Back in 1858, a German explorer named Heinrich Barth was making his way across the vast expanse of the Sahara Desert. His primary goal was to reach Timbuktu, the legendary city located at the desert's far edge. Barth was a skilled traveler who could speak Arabic along with several local African languages, and he meticulously documented every location he passed through. His trek around West Africa would eventually cover nearly 20,000 kilometers. Yet Barth was always hunting for new sights to discover. On the difficult return leg of his expedition, he picked up rumors about a place that very few Europeans had ever laid eyes on. His guides described a massive, ruined city hidden deep in the African bush, a city they called Gao, which had once commanded the continent's greatest empire. Barth wrote that once he understood Gao had been the capital of a mighty empire for centuries, his desire to visit it became even stronger than his drive to reach Timbuktu. He realized this place had been the heart of a great national movement where powerful princes launched successful conquests. So he packed his gear and set out with his guides, tracing the path of the Niger River. They pushed through swampy lowlands and flat desert plains, constantly batting away mosquitoes and tsetse flies, until they finally arrived at the ancient site. However, the reality was a letdown. Instead of a grand metropolis, he found a tiny village of about 300 huts and piles of debris covered in weeds where the city used to be. Barth noted that this formerly bustling locality, which writers agreed was once Africa's most splendid city, had become a desolate home for a small and struggling population. Right across from his tent stood a huge, ruined tower, which was the last remnant of the capital's main mosque. Surrounding their open camp was a circle of lush vegetation, and in the clear morning light he could see palms, tamarind trees, and sycamores. There were silk cotton trees, too. Not one to be discouraged, he investigated the wreckage of the ancient city, carefully recording everything he observed. It seemed that during its most prosperous time, the town measured about 6 miles in circumference. A dense thicket of silk bushes completely encircled the eastern quarter of the mosque, growing over the deserted sections of the former city. The mosque itself originally consisted of a low building with large towers on the east and west, all sitting within a courtyard ringed by an 8-foot wall. While the eastern tower is in ruins, the western one remains in reasonably good condition, rising in 7 steps that gradually narrow toward the top. Inhabitants still come to pray in this holy space where their great conqueror was laid to rest, although they don't have the strength to repair the structure. His guides revealed that this place was once the capital of an empire known as the Songhai. Barth left the ruins of Gao behind, passing through the groves of silk cotton and sycamore trees as he resumed his long journey home. However, the image of that shattered city remained fixed in his mind. Everywhere he traveled, he found himself asking the same questions. How did the Songhai Empire manage to expand to such a massive size within the unforgiving terrain of the southern Sahara? How did its people maintain social cohesion and construct such magnificent buildings? And why, after ascending to such incredible heights, did they abandon it all to crumble into the dust and shifting sand dunes? This narrative focuses on a society that has been largely overlooked in popular history, the Songhai people of West Africa. We will explore how this great civilization emerged from some of the most difficult conditions on Earth, how they merged 2 conflicting traditions to create a diverse, cosmopolitan society, and how they became the greatest empire in African history. We also need to understand why, after little more than a century of dominance, their entire world collapsed around them. To understand this history, we must look at cycles. The first cycle belongs to the planet itself. As Earth rotates through the black void of space, turning on its axis, it creates the rhythm of day and night. Yet, there is a second planetary cycle that influences us just as deeply, though it moves much, much slower. This is the Earth's wobble, scientifically known as axial precession. This wobbling motion is generated by the slight gravitational pull of other planets in our solar system, and it shifts the angle of our planet's tilt by roughly 1 degree every 72 years. Eventually, the Earth tilts a full 23 degrees in each direction. This entire loop takes more than 25,000 years to complete, and the shifting angle can trigger radical changes in the climate on the surface. For the past 8 millennia or so, one major consequence of this planetary wobble has been a dramatic shift in the pattern of African monsoon rains. As these rains were pushed further south, a massive arid zone opened up across the northern territories. This climatic shift gave birth to one of the most striking geographic features on Earth, the Sahara Desert. Covering a staggering 9 million square kilometers, the Sahara is a colossal expanse of rock plateaus, salt flats, and endless oceans of sand dunes. To put that in perspective, this single desert accounts for roughly 30% of the African continent. However, as recently as 5,000 years ago, these barren dunes were actually rolling, green grasslands. Back then, the landscape was crisscrossed by winding rivers and massive lakes that sustained late Stone Age communities. It wasn't just grass, either. Sparse forests dotted the land, filled with olive, lime, walnut, and oak trees. We know this because ancient rock paintings, dating back to around 3000 BC, have been found right in the middle of the central Sahara. These artworks depict thriving animals and lush vegetation in places that are currently nothing more than empty wasteland. But as the planet continued its tilting cycle, time began to run out for this green paradise. The rains slowly retreated from the region, causing the larger vegetation to perish first, leaving only the grass. Eventually, even the grass withered away. Without roots to anchor the soil or plant cover to absorb the sun's intense heat, the topsoil simply dried out and was carried off by the wind. Gradually, those fertile valleys transformed into dry plains, then into desert, and finally became the giant Sahara we recognize today. As the desert relentlessly expanded, Neolithic populations were forced to run for their lives. Pushed out of the Sahara, they clustered along its borders. Some groups migrated northeast to the fertile Nile Valley, where they would eventually establish the legendary civilization of the pharaohs. However, other groups headed south to create a civilization of their own. This brings us to the Sahel, the region directly south of the Sahara, where much of our story unfolds. The name itself comes from the Arabic word Sahel, which translates to shore or coast. That is because early inhabitants viewed this strip of land as the solid coastline bordering a great sea of sand that stretches for nearly the entire horizon. That vast expanse continues for another 2,000 kilometers before finally meeting the Mediterranean, but the Sahel itself serves as a unique zone of transition. It is neither the sandy desert found to the north nor the tropical savanna found to the south. Stretching 5,000 kilometers from the Red Sea all the way to the Atlantic coast, it is a landscape defined by semi-arid steppes and grasslands, broken up by acacia trees, thorn bushes, and scrubland. Existence here depends heavily on the regular monsoon rains. During the extended dry season, annual grasses die off and many trees shed their leaves completely. Several types of buffalo and gazelle compete for survival here alongside major predators like the lion, cheetah, and African wild dog. However, there are pockets of incredible abundance in this otherwise dry terrain, and the source of that richness is actually visible from outer space. Rising from the mountainous highlands of southeastern Guinea, West Africa's longest river travels inland for more than 4,000 kilometers in a dramatic sickle-shaped curve. This is the Niger River, and its name is believed to originate from the Berber phrase Jur en Jur, which translates to river of rivers. It is an exceptionally fertile waterway. At its widest point, the river measures nearly a kilometer across, and it brings life-giving floods every single year across the land. This creates a vast expanse that transforms the barren desert into a green landscape. As a matter of fact, the cultivation zone here is over 5 times larger than the famous area surrounding Egypt's Nile River, enabling the locals to harvest millet, rice, and couscous for 6 months of the year. A medieval West African chronicle called the Tariq al-Fadash offers a radiant description of this region's splendor and riches. It notes that Mali includes 400 towns and possesses incredibly fertile soil. Among the world's sovereign kingdoms, the text claims only Syria surpasses it in beauty, and it describes the residents as wealthy people who live very well. Based on oral traditions, the history of human habitation along the Niger starts with a group called the Sorko. They established settlements on the riverbanks and fashioned boats out of African mahogany. They were soon met by the Gao people, expert hunters who could take down river-dwelling crocodiles and hippos. Next, the Du people joined them, having adapted to farming within the rich floodplains. Finally, a tough group from the north arrived. Calling themselves the Songhai, they were the first to introduce horses to the area. Since its inception, this was a blended civilization that thrived by combining previously separate groups into a unified success. The Sorko's riverboats, the Gao's hunting abilities, and the Du's farming knowledge were all supercharged by the horse's power. All these factors combined to launch a complex, interconnected society that would eternally rely on the Niger River as its life source. But their journey from these humble beginnings would certainly not be a straightforward or simple path. Throughout recorded history, several great empires ascended in West Africa. But first, I think we should pause for a moment to ask, what exactly is an empire? At its core, an empire is a violent phenomenon. It happens when one kingdom or state becomes stronger than its neighbor, invades to conquer them, and rules over both territories by force. The original nation, known as the imperial center, usually extracts wealth and resources from the subjects they have conquered. They may also attempt to impose their culture and way of life upon them. Empires grow in this specific way, absorbing neighbors and turning them into so-called client states. They become more powerful, yet as is usually the case, they also grow more unstable. Eventually, the bubble bursts. Whether due to economic collapse, poor leadership, or imperial overreach, the empire falters. The client states demand their freedom, the power holding the imperial center together fails, and the whole structure cracks like an eggshell. This is often a time of massive unrest, where the once mighty capital city might even go up in flames. But for the strongest client states, this lack of central authority represents an opportunity. They might begin expanding their own territory and perhaps build an empire of their own. There are many theories regarding how empires operate and grow, but this simplified version is known as the imperial cycle. I believe this framework is valuable when analyzing West African history. Some regional empires followed this pattern precisely, while others attempted to defy it with varying degrees of luck. The inaugural empire to develop in this zone was the Empire of Ghana. Emerging on the edge of the Sahara Desert during the 8th century, its citizens pioneered local iron working, granting them a significant military superiority. It is evident that by the year 1000, Ghana had subjugated many border states and started constructing a legitimate empire. Yet, the secret behind Ghana's triumph hinged on a single factor that would become crucial for all subsequent empires. In reality, this was not an object but a creature. Until roughly the year 300, horses served as the primary transport in West Africa. While a horse is fast and robust on firm soil, it is terribly equipped for the desert's shifting dunes and unforgiving atmosphere. In July and August, daytime heat in the Sahara frequently hits 50 degrees Celsius, or above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The area is also plagued by sandstorms, the deadliest being the simoom, or poison wind. These arid, scorching gusts climb to 54 degrees Celsius, or over 130 Fahrenheit, heat intense enough to scald human skin. The simoom is notorious for triggering rapid heat stroke in travelers because it transfers heat to the body faster than sweat can evaporate. This forces the body to overheat rapidly, causing major organs to shut down. However, starting in the 4th century, a brilliant innovation started arriving from Arabia. It was an animal equipped with wide, flat feet and specific biological tweaks that made it the ultimate survivor in the intense heat. Among these traits was the famous hump on its back, effectively designed to store water. The camel had finally arrived in West Africa. This introduction completely revolutionized the Saharan economy. Because these beasts could transport massive loads of up to 150 kilograms, organized trade on a grand scale suddenly became feasible across the desert. While the West African economy was already thriving, it was now abruptly connected to the wealthy markets of the Mediterranean. This link marked the dawn of a brand new era for people on both sides. To move goods across the Sahara, merchants relied on the caravan system, vast processions of camels loaded high with merchandise and luxury items. Ibn Battuta, the 14th-century Arab writer, noted that the average caravan size was around 1,000 camels, though they could swell to a staggering 12,000 animals. It would have been a breathtaking spectacle, winding like a snake across the red desert sands for miles. Historically, three primary routes cut through the central Sahara, zigzagging between desert oases. An oasis existed where an aquifer or underground river met a layer of solid rock beneath the sand, forcing fresh water up to the surface. For thousands of years, humans settled these wet spots. Inside these small pockets, they actually reversed the process that created the Sahara. They started by planting resilient date palms, creating a canopy of shade that allowed smaller trees like figs, olives, and apricots to grow underneath. These green islands formed vital pit stops along the desert trade routes. They were so strategically important that military control of these tiny settlements often meant commanding the entire trade route and all its accompanying wealth. If you drove these routes today in a modern car at highway speeds, it would take over 70 hours of non-stop driving. However, for medieval travelers moving with huge herds of camels, the crossing took roughly 2 months. The journey was so long that about 1/3 of the camels in a caravan were packed solely with supplies just for the trip itself. Under such harsh conditions, even the camels struggled. After a journey, the animals required months of recovery. A 4-month round trip usually earned them an 8-month rest. The kingdoms of West Africa used these sandy trails to transport spices, ivory, wheat, and exotic animals to Europe, alongside a constant trade in slaves. While the transatlantic slave trade found in history books transported millions of Africans to the Americas over roughly 400 years. While that era was unique in its sheer size and cruelty, it certainly didn't mark the origin of slavery. In truth, various types of human bondage have likely existed since agricultural societies first began. Major powers like ancient Rome, Greece, and Carthage were all well-known slave states. Furthermore, when the Roman Empire collapsed in Europe, the resulting instability only caused slave raiding to increase. However, as Europe gradually adopted Christianity over the first millennium, the Church started imposing regulations against enslaving fellow Christians. By the year 1000, the practice of Christians owning Christians had largely ceased in feudal Europe. It is important to note, though, that this was substituted by the extensive system of serfdom. Under this structure, peasant workers fared little better than slaves, as they could still be purchased and traded by feudal lords. Nevertheless, owning non-Christian slaves remained permissible and continued throughout the Middle Ages. Whenever Christian realms battled with kingdoms of the Muslim world, prisoners of war were regularly seized as slaves by both parties. But for both Muslims and Christians alike, the land south of the Sahara served as a seemingly endless reservoir of forced labor. Ever since the initial trade routes opened up across the desert, northern powers forcibly extracted human manpower from Africa. These enslaved people endured terrible conditions while being moved across the sands, eventually ending up in slave markets ranging from North Africa to the Byzantine Empire, and even as far away as Spain and Venice. While they often worked as servants or manual laborers, many were also conscripted to fight in various medieval armies. It is incredibly difficult to think about this cruel practice, but slavery was an inescapable reality of the era. We have to admit the impact it had on the region's history if we want to truly understand the events that follow. Yet there was a natural resource in West Africa worth even more than slaves, spices, or ivory. This material existed here in quantities unmatched by the rest of the known world: gold. The human mind has always had a strange reaction to gold. Its warm hue and shiny finish trigger a deep desire in us. We feel a need to drape it over our bodies, adorn our architecture with it, and build whole economic systems based on it. More than any other substance, this rare metal has always implied a connection to the divine. The ancient Egyptians referred to gold as the breath of God, while the Aztecs described it as the sweat of the sun. Interestingly, these ancient concepts of gold being a heavenly metal aren't far from scientific fact. Like the majority of heavy metals, gold is actually created inside stars through nuclear fusion. Stars, much like great empires, go through a life cycle. They expand until they become what we call a supergiant, growing thousands of times bigger than our sun. Eventually, the star begins a fatal collapse. While most stars just shed their outer shells and fade away, a tiny fraction, maybe less than 1%, explode in a supernova. For a brief moment, this blast of light and energy rivals the brightness of a whole galaxy, and this is the furnace where gold is made. Roughly 200 million years after Earth was born, asteroids bombarded the planet, bringing gold raining down from the heavens. West Africa is remarkably wealthy in this rare element. In fact, before the Americas were revealed to the world in the 1500s, this specific region produced more gold than anywhere else on Earth. The volume of precious metal leaving Africa was so vast that Arabs and Europeans started convincing themselves there was one massive secret source. They imagined a single mountain of gold hidden away by African monarchs. This belief eventually sparked legends similar to King Solomon's mines. However, the truth was completely different. West African gold didn't come from one giant location, but rather from innumerable small panning sites and tiny mines scattered across the territory. Usually, gold is trapped inside quartz crystals in the form of nuggets or flecks. Over the centuries, river water erodes the crystals, releasing the gold into the streams. Most of the gold in West Africa wasn't excavated from deep underground mines. It was sifted from the banks of the Niger and Senegal rivers. The region's dramatic climate shifts actually supported this industry. During the extended dry season, plants withered and farming became impossible. Consequently, farmers would put away their agricultural equipment and switch to prospecting. Ibn al-Faqih, a 10th-century geographer from Iran, seemingly heard about this. In his text, The Book of Lands, he claims that gold in Africa grows in the sand like carrots and gets harvested at dawn. These part-time miners would collect their small stashes of gold dust and await the arrival of trade caravans. Because there were so many different languages spoken in the region, these deals often relied on a method called silent barter. Traders would display their merchandise on rugs, items like tools, ornaments, spices, food, and the ever-crucial salt, which was rare in sub-Saharan Africa but vital for food preservation. The merchants would then blast trumpets and beat heavy drums before retreating out of view. At that point, the local prospectors would step out and lay their gold flecks and nuggets next to the items they desired, proposing a value. The traders would then come back to check the offer. If they liked the price, they took the gold. They would then head back north to swap the gold with North African merchants, receiving exotic Mediterranean products and more salt in exchange. Before long, a metaphorical river of gold was streaming northward across the desert. This trade network allowed the early West African kingdoms to accumulate a staggering amount of riches. To give you a clearer picture of the sheer wealth we are talking about, it is worth looking at the example of one of Africa's most legendary rulers, a man whose name is etched in history as Mansa Musa, widely considered the wealthiest individual to ever walk the earth. Before we get to him, however, we must look at the Empire of Ghana. After dominating West Africa for 5 centuries, Ghana entered a period of decline sometime in the 1200s. It went through the final phases of that same imperial cycle we discussed earlier. Its central authority crumbled, its client states pushed for independence, and eventually one of its own conquered subjects rose up to eclipse it in power. This rising force absorbed Ghana's old territories and seized control of the profitable trade routes across the Sahara. This marked the dawn of a new superpower. Eventually, the Kingdom of Ghana was completely swallowed by this ascending force, which would become known to the world as the Empire of Mali. The Mali Empire didn't just inherit the assets and influence of its predecessor. It expanded the trans-Saharan trade network to a truly mind-boggling scale. Its most renowned monarch, Mansa Musa, was actually a genius when it came to public relations. His fame was so widespread that he was even featured on the Catalan Atlas, a medieval map from Europe, where he is depicted holding a gold coin and wearing a golden crown. The path Musa took to ascend the throne of Mali is perhaps one of the most unusual tales of royal succession in the historical record. The year was 1312. Musa was an elite member of the Malian court, serving under an eccentric ruler named Abu Bakr II. Musa was about 32 years old when he was called for an audience with the king. Abu Bakr informed Musa that he was being appointed as deputy to govern the empire in the king's stead while he was away. This was a common enough occurrence, as monarchs who went on military campaigns or religious pilgrimages would often designate deputies to rule in their place. However, the king's intended destination was strange enough to raise a few eyebrows. Near the end of his reign, the old King Abu Bakr became obsessed with the theory that it was possible to sail across the Atlantic Ocean and reach the other side. In fact, he became completely fixated on this idea. The Arab historian Shihab al-Umari actually spoke to Mansa Musa later on and recorded the king's own account of what happened next. The ruler before Musa believed that the ocean encircled the earth. To prove this, he outfitted 200 ships with men, along with enough water and provisions to last for several years. He commanded the admiral not to return until they reached the end of the ocean. They set sail, and a long time passed without word. Finally, only a single ship returned. The sailors on that lone boat reported a terrifying disaster. They claimed the fleet encountered a massive whirlpool that dragged every other ship beneath the waves, leaving only their vessel afloat. It is highly probable that the fleet was wrecked during an Atlantic storm, though this whirlpool might have also been the formidable Canary Current that flows down the African continent. King Abu Bakr, however, was not deterred. He seemingly decided that if you want a job done right, you must do it yourself. He prepared a massive armada of 2,000 ships for himself and his men, plus another 1,000 ships just for supplies. He then departed with his crew on this monumental voyage, never to return. This narrative has long captivated historians of West Africa. Ultimately, history would prove Abu Bakr right. Other lands really did exist beyond the ocean, and with the passage of just a few centuries, the fate of Africa would become permanently linked to those distant shores. Some historians have gone looking for proof that Abu Bakr II actually made it to the Americas almost 2 centuries before Columbus, though that search is perhaps a bit fanciful. The truth is, there isn't any concrete evidence to support the idea. Furthermore, our only source for this tale comes from his successor, Mansa Musa. As we will see, monarchs tend to be somewhat secretive regarding the specific details of how the previous ruler died. However, the storyteller within me finds this anecdote too compelling to ignore. The sheer strangeness of it makes me want to believe it. Just imagine an incredibly rich emperor, bored with his earthly possessions, sailing onto the vast ocean on a doomed mission, only to drown while seeking a new world. Regardless of how he took the throne, we know for a fact that Musa was a terrifyingly efficient leader. Over the course of his rule, he grew the Mali Empire by capturing 24 additional cities, integrating them into the biggest empire Africa had ever witnessed. Yet a single specific event would cement his legacy. It demonstrated his flair for marketing himself and guaranteed that Arabs and Europeans would speak his name for hundreds of years. That event was his incredibly costly pilgrimage to Mecca. As usually happens, trade routes transport more than just merchandise. human culture moves along those paths as well. With commerce increasing across the Sahara, West Africa began encountering fascinating new lifestyles. The most significant of these foreign introductions was Arab culture, which brought the relatively new faith of Islam. For Mali's early rulers, adopting Islam served as a ticket into the Mediterranean sphere. It was a method for building influence and finding acceptance among those potent kingdoms. Sundiata Keita, who reigned in the early 1200s, almost a century prior to Musa, is the first Malian monarch we can confirm was Muslim. However, faith created a deep crack running through West African society, separating the wealthy from the impoverished and the urbanites from the rural population. The villagers and farmers of West Africa, those who tended livestock and worked the soil, were generally animists. Broadly defined, this meant they venerated their forebears as well as ancient nature spirits and the magic residing in forests and mountain peaks. Muslim records describe these spiritual practices with obvious disdain. They note that these people worship idols in stones and trees, offering sacrifices and prayers to them for help. The texts also mention that sorcerers and diviners live among them. Conversely, Islam dominated the cities, at least nominally. For a West African resident back then, converting offered several advantages. It fostered better relationships for trading with merchants crossing the desert, and occasionally, it enabled people to dodge specific taxes. Additionally, it protected individuals from the ever bolder slave raiders descending from the Sahara. Much like in Christian Europe, Islamic law forbade a Muslim from enslaving a fellow believer, and this ban was strictly observed. Makhlouf el-Belbali, a scholar from the 1300s, was among the first to codify this rule. He wrote that anyone identified as coming from known Islamic lands who claims that origin must be released and declared a free person. This was the judgment of the Andalusian legal experts. Arguments occasionally broke out regarding the legality of selling slaves who converted only after capture. For the Mali Empire itself, adopting Islam provided comparable security. Just as in Christian Europe, Muslim monarchs were only permitted to wage war if it was legally authorized. Such a sanctioned conflict was called a jihad, or holy struggle, and legal permission was almost never granted for war against another Islamic state. When Mansa Musa became king, Mali had already been a Muslim state for more than a century. Musa, however, was deeply pious and would establish lasting connections with the broader Islamic sphere. He eventually embarked on his pilgrimage to Mecca starting in 1324. Yet, even during this spiritual obligation, Musa appeared very conscious of his public perception. Reports say he journeyed with a spectacular entourage that shocked the medieval world. His caravan included 60,000 people, featuring a personal guard of 12,000 enslaved men dressed in Persian silk and brocade, all holding staffs made of gold. He is also said to have brought a luggage train of 80 camels, with every camel hauling 300 pounds of gold dust. At current market prices, that amount would be worth roughly $500 million, or 500 million. In every city where he paused, Mansa Musa handed out massive quantities of gold to the impoverished. Yet this generosity triggered a number of unintended consequences. All along his pilgrimage path, specifically through Cairo, Medina, and Mecca, he left economic turmoil in his wake. The sudden flood of riches caused the value of the metal to crash for the next 10 years, sparking massive inflation that ruined their local economies. On his return journey, perhaps feeling guilty about the financial destruction, Musa actually borrowed back all the gold he could find in Egypt to try and stabilize the market. This stands as the only moment in history where a single person controlled the global price of gold. However, the Mali Empire, despite its incredible wealth, was not destined to last forever. It would soon follow in Ghana's footsteps through the cycle of empires. A subordinate state, which was just starting to build its power, would soon become the true protagonist of our story and the largest empire in African history, the Kingdom of Songhai. Now is the right time to note that there are essentially three categories of historical sources for this region of West Africa, and they frequently provide conflicting details. The first group consists of Arab historians and travelers who trekked across the Sahara and recorded their observations. Two figures stand out for the depth and length of their accounts. One is Ibn Battuta, often called the Moroccan Marco Polo. Over 30 years in the 14th century, he roamed the Middle East, North and Sub-Saharan Africa, then moved through Afghanistan, Central Asia, India, and Sri Lanka, finally reaching China. It was during one of these grand expeditions that he explored the West African kingdoms at the height of the Mali Empire. Almost 2 centuries later, in the early 1500s, a Spanish Moor known as Leo Africanus toured West Africa. Later, he was seized by European pirates and taken to Rome, where he was forced to convert to Christianity and wrote down the stories of his travels. However, visitors like these were rare. Each account acts like a snapshot, freezing a specific moment in time, and they can be frustratingly vague about details that interest modern historians. Beyond those external accounts, our second wellspring of information is the indigenous storytelling heritage of West Africa itself. This region maintains a unique folkloric custom presided over by a mysterious class of holy mystics known as griots. For thousands of years, these individuals have fulfilled a multifaceted role in West African society, acting simultaneously as poets, singers, musicians, historians, and storytellers. Griots served as living libraries for oral tradition, committing vast histories to memory and passing them down through the ages. Often viewed as wise men or magicians, they frequently held high-ranking positions as advisors to rulers. While you can still find griots practicing this ancient craft in places like modern Mali today, their stories, like most global folklore, were rarely written down before the 19th century. Consequently, the narratives can vary significantly between regions, and while they are precious cultural treasures, they can be a frustrating resource for historians. For the griot, the line distinguishing history from myth is incredibly thin. Their accounts are woven with fantastical elements, featuring sorcerers and magic, yet they remain an amazing tool for understanding how the local people perceived their own past. Furthermore, studies of this folklore are often used to cross-reference and strengthen other historical sources. The third and final source is a blend of the previous two, the scribes of Timbuktu. We will explore Timbuktu in depth later, but for now, picture it as a library city on the desert's edge. It was the center of a serious academic tradition where learned men were trained within an international network of intellectuals stretching from the libraries of Alexandria and Baghdad to the mosques of Cordoba in Spain. These scribes were genuinely dedicated to recording history. Some even traveled alongside West African kings specifically to document events as they happened. Two of the most famous works produced by this tradition are the * Timbuktu Chronicles, the * Tariq al-Fadash, Chronicle of the Seeker, and the * Tariq al-Sudan, Chronicle of Africa. We will draw heavily from both of these texts. Although many scholarly families in Timbuktu claimed Arab-Muslim ancestry, they were predominantly West African and deeply immersed in the ancient traditions of the populations surrounding them. Despite pretending otherwise, they were not immune to the influence of the griots. This influence seeps into the Timbuktu Chronicles, which are packed with dream visions, prophecies, and supernatural tales where men shapeshift into animals and monarchs converse with demons. For instance, the * Tariq al-Fadash shares an origin myth for the Songhai people involving a ruler who was half man and half fish. This creature supposedly swam up the Niger River every night to terrorize his subjects until a hero killed the beast and became the first Songhai king. However, the scribe recording this seems slightly embarrassed by the tale, including an anxious disclaimer that admits most of the stories are likely untrue and asks for forgiveness from God. It is also important to note that both chronicles were political documents commissioned by kings, meaning they often massaged the facts to present their patrons in the most flattering light. However, if we use these accounts cautiously, overlapping them and placing them in conversation with other evidence, they become invaluable for uncovering what actually happened during this era. So that is the toolkit we have to rely on. The fragmentary, questionable reports from Arab travelers, the griot spinning tales of ancient times, and the Timbuktu scribes trying to organize it, all while appeasing a king breathing down their necks. Because all these sources are naturally unreliable, the region's history is full of blank spaces and questions that I will attempt to navigate as we move forward. The earliest written records mentioning the kingdom of Songhai appear in the 10th century. They describe a small realm along the banks of the Niger River, and for a long time, that is all it was. Songhai was centered on the city of Gao, a massive trading terminus located where the vast Sahara met the green floodplain of the Niger. Just outside the city, a giant sand dune dominates the skyline. It is known as the Rose Dune because of the reddish color it turns at sunrise. Since antiquity, it was believed to be a gathering place for sorcerers who met there after dark to perform spells and rituals. Despite the royal court of Songhai officially adopting Islam as early as the year 1019, the city of Gao retained a distinct character. Perhaps more than any other city in the region, it held onto a deep connection with the ancient ways of Africa. Gao was a cosmopolitan marketplace where African goods like gold, ivory, kola nuts, slaves, spices, palm oil, and precious woods were exchanged for Mediterranean imports such as salt, textiles, weapons, copper, and horses. It functioned as an entrepot, an entry port and terminus for a vast web of trade routes. In the 16th century, the explorer Leo Africanus visited Gao and wrote about the rich commerce he witnessed arriving from Europe. He marveled at the quality and cost of the merchandise, noting that horses purchased in Europe for 10 ducats were resold there for 40 or even 50 ducats apiece, and that even coarse European cloth found eager buyers. For instance, a cubit of Venetian scarlet or Turkish cloth, which costs less than 4 ducats in Europe, sells here for 30. Swords that are valued at 3 or 4 crowns back home, along with spears, bridles, and spices, are all sold at incredibly high rates. Yet despite these markups, salt remains the most expensive commodity of all. While gold was the universal standard for trade, another form of currency was also widespread in the region: cowrie shells. These small shells, which come from a sea snail found in the Indian Ocean, served a purpose very similar to gold. They were beautiful enough to be desirable everywhere, yet rare enough to be a secure store of value. Essentially, they functioned like coins long before coins were actually minted. In fact, the classical Chinese character for money is even derived from a stylized drawing of a cowrie shell. By the year 1325, whether measured in gold or cowries, the wealth of Gao had swollen to such massive proportions that Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali and the richest man in the world, decided he had to have it. Musa ordered his forces to march on Gao and absorb the city into his domain. Over the preceding centuries, Mali's immense wealth had transformed it into a formidable military machine. If the historical accounts are accurate, Mali boasted an army of 100,000 soldiers at this time, including 10,000 cavalrymen drawn from the aristocracy, much like European knights. Ironworking had been perfected during the days of the Ghana Empire, and now entire clans of Mali's Mandinka people were dedicated to the craft, churning out swords, spearheads, and arrows for the imperial army. These troops were equipped with leather helmets and occasionally iron chainmail imported from Arabia. While a certain percentage of the army was likely composed of slave soldiers and conscripted citizens, many were professional warriors. The force also incorporated specialized units from the various territories within the empire. Oral historians describe the use of poison archers from the Sankarani River in the south, fire archers from Wagadu in the north, and heavy cavalry from the northern state of Mima. Against such a juggernaut, the small city-state of Gao stood little chance and was quickly folded into the Empire of Mali. However, by all accounts, Gao actually prospered as a client state under this greater power. When the Arab explorer Ibn Battuta visited Gao 28 years later, in 1353, he was impressed. Battuta is often quite scathing in his writings about Africa, frequently scandalized by local customs and what he considered rude manners. For example, at one point he turned up his nose at a meal of pounded millet, honey and milk offered by a local chief, claiming it convinced him there was no good to be hoped for from these people, and that he should return to Morocco immediately. It is telling, then, that he was greatly impressed by the sight of Gao's walls, gates, mosques, and the rich surplus of food in its storehouses. He described it as a great town on the Niger and one of the finest, largest, and most fertile cities in Africa, filled with rice, milk, chickens, fish, and a specific type of cucumber with no equal. For a time, the Mali Empire seemed invincible, but great weaknesses were hiding just beneath the surface. All it took for those cracks to emerge was the death of the great King Mansa Musa. Until very recently, one of the most dangerous challenges any society faced was the issue of royal succession. For most of history, nations were ruled by kings, but the death of a monarch could turn the question of who would rule next into a lethal crisis. If a king named a successor or had an heir, that person had a strong claim, but they still needed overwhelming support from the nobles and lords. If a king died without an heir, multiple challengers might rise up. In the worst scenarios, the country would be carved up among these challengers, leading to civil war. If you look at all the wars of succession in history, they represent a colossal waste of time and resources, to say nothing of the human suffering involved. These conflicts routinely destroyed industries, decimated populations, and brought countries to their knees. In many ways, they were more dangerous than earthquakes, famines, or plagues, and people lived in constant fear of them. In Europe, kings were terrified of dying without a son. In West Africa, however, the problem was usually not too few sons, but too many. Because West African kings often had multiple wives, with 4 being permitted under medieval laws, the odds of dying without a male heir were much lower than in Europe. According to chronicles, the Songhai king Askia Mohammed had 37 sons during his reign, while oral traditions put the number closer to 500. The issue wasn't just sons fighting for the crown. Large families meant a king also had numerous brothers who might fancy a shot at the throne themselves. With so many potential claimants, it was absolutely essential to have clear, universally agreed-upon laws regarding succession. Unfortunately, that is exactly what West African kingdoms lacked. The laws that did exist were elaborate and needlessly complicated, meaning that when a king died, there were often multiple interpretations of who the rightful heir was. This is a pattern we see repeated constantly. West Africa flourished during the long reigns of great kings, but the death of those kings almost always led to disaster. In Mali, Mansa Musa died in 1337 and was initially replaced by his son, Magan. However, Musa also had a brother named Suleiman. Magan ruled for only 4 years before his uncle struck, killing him and seizing the throne. This illegitimate act enraged the kingdom's lords, who brought forth their own contesting claims. The resulting succession crisis shattered the unity of the empire. Suddenly, Mali's strong, united army splintered into factions that began fighting one another. Sensing weakness in the once great empire, horsemen from the land of Massi in the south crossed the Niger River and began raiding around Timbuktu. Paralyzed by civil war, the Malians were unable to respond, and the border raids grew bolder. Soon, the empire's client states took notice. The distant coastal kingdom of Jollof was the first to declare independence. When Mali failed to march on Jollof to restore order, other client states saw their chance. Mali had always been a project where a single ethnicity, the Mande, projected power over a variety of other tribes and regions. At the first sign of trouble, these other groups sought to throw off the yoke of Mande rule. Suleiman, the uncle who had killed Mansa Musa's son, soon died and passed the throne to his own son, who was then overthrown by another, who was in turn overthrown by yet another. During this crisis, the average king ruled for barely a few years, and imperial authority collapsed. Client states broke away in droves, including the wealthy trading hub of Gao. By this time, the king of Mali was a man named Musa II, but he was a ruler in name only. The true power behind the throne was his counselor and advisor, Mari Jata, who at one point even threw the young king in jail to keep him out of the way. Between this bizarre political situation, decades of civil war, and financial mismanagement, the legitimacy of the Mali Empire hit an all-time low. With Mali's eastern provinces now in open rebellion, the city of Gao declared independence. For the royal vizier Mari Jata, the loss of this great city, more than any other rebellious state, must have been a crushing blow. Determined to crush the rebellion, he immediately dispatched the great Malian army to restore order in the east. The army found some success, recapturing the important copper mining town of Teikta in the north. But when they finally reached Gao, the newly formed Kingdom of Songhai put up a much stronger resistance. By this time, the city of Gao had evolved beyond simple defense. They had actively seized vast territories in the east to bolster their strength. It appears they also rallied other disparate resistance groups against Mali, effectively creating a unified rebel coalition. Their strategy relied heavily on guerrilla warfare, launching raids on Mali's urban centers and utilizing riverboats on the Niger to rapidly deploy large numbers of troops for surprise attacks where they would be most devastating. These tactics enabled the Songhai kingdom to gridlock the larger, yet significantly weakened Malian army, resulting in a prolonged stalemate. However, the fate of this conflict was not decided on the battlefield. The Mali Empire was being torn apart from within by an endless cycle of royal assassinations. In 1387, the sickly King Musa II passed away, possibly while still imprisoned and likely not from natural causes. Regardless of the circumstances, the royal vizier, Mari Jata, refused to relinquish control. He murdered Musa's brothers and seized the throne for himself, only to rule for a single year before being assassinated. As chaos spread, more provinces revolted, and the Masi people launched fresh attacks on the empire. To make matters worse, an invasion by the nomadic Tuareg people from the desert severed Mali's access to the critical northern trade routes across the Sahara. This economic blow meant Mali could no longer import the horses vital for its army, nor could it fund its expensive wars. For the next century, Mali was locked in a desperate struggle for survival. During this period of total collapse, the rebellious city of Gao was largely ignored, allowing the Kingdom of Songhai to fully establish itself by the 1430s. The great wheel of the imperial cycle was turning once again. Amidst this turmoil, the young Kingdom of Songhai saw a chance to rise from the ashes of the old empire. The following century witnessed the continued deterioration of Mali alongside the ascent of Songhai. By the close of the 15th century, this new kingdom was positioned to become one of the great powers of Africa. One specific man, a ruthless and terrifying military commander, was prepared to seize the opportunity created by this chaos. His name was Sunni Ali. Sunni Ali remains perhaps the most polarizing figure in all of African history. While his early life and origins remain obscure, his time as a leader was defined by fierce military prowess and boundless ambition. He ascended to the Songhai throne in 1464, initiating an era of unprecedented expansion that would eventually see his kingdom stretch even farther than the Mali Empire ever had. However, history remembers Sunni Ali through two very different lenses within Songhai society. In the oral traditions of the griots, he is celebrated as Ali Bur, or Ali the Great. These stories depict him as a wise and powerful founding father who commanded magic. Conversely, the chronicles written by Muslim scholars paint him as a cruel tyrant. The historical record known as the Tariq al-Fatash is particularly harsh, branding him the tyrant, the cursed, and the oppressor, describing him as a man of shameful conduct. What is undeniable is that Sunni Ali went to war almost immediately after taking power. He was obsessed with modernizing and reorganizing his military forces. Having witnessed the collapse of Mali due to a lack of cavalry, he resolved to breed horses on a massive scale within Africa. He constructed vast stables to protect the animals from the weather and the deadly tsetse fly, and he pioneered crossbreeding techniques to create sturdy horses adapted to the African environment. He also introduced heavy cavalry, equipped with iron breastplates worn beneath their tunics. While these must have been incredibly hot and difficult to wear in the African climate, They added immense weight and protection to his soldiers. Another of his great passions was the river navy. He expanded the small raiding vessels Songhai had used during their rebellion into a massive fleet of 400 boats capable of transporting troops up and down the Niger River with incredible speed. He even bestowed upon one of his generals the title Master of the Water. His reliance on these boats was so profound that during the siege of Jen, which was located kilometers away from the river, Sunni Ali ordered a long canal to be dug just so his fleet could continue supplying his men on the front lines. Under his leadership, the Songhai abandoned hit-and-run guerrilla tactics in favor of a more sustained and aggressive style of warfare. The Tariq al-Sudan Chronicle highlights his remarkable track record, noting that he was always victorious and conquered every village he targeted, from Kanta to Sibirijugu. His armies never faced defeat. A significant factor in his success appears to have been his extreme ruthlessness, which is detailed in the Timbuktu Chronicles. Much like the Mongols or Assyrians, military leaders throughout history have utilized terror as a weapon. It can be a highly effective tactic. If your enemies are terrified of you, they are more likely to flee or surrender, saving you time and resources in your conquest. Sunni Ali certainly employed this strategy to great effect, yet many believe the actions attributed to him went far beyond simple tactical brutality. Take, for instance, his treatment of the Fulani tribe. He appeared to harbor a specific, unexplained loathing for these people. When they dared to rebel against their Songhai conquerors, Sunni Ali marched on them and ordered mass executions. If the historical chronicles are to be believed, the massacre was so thorough that the entire remaining population could gather beneath the shade of a single tree. His temperament was reportedly incredibly volatile. He would fly into sudden rages, condemning people to death, only to abruptly change his mind later and set them free. Because of this unpredictable and often savage nature, the great chronicles of Timbuktu described Sunni Ali using a staggering array of epithets. He was labeled Ali the Merciless, the Degenerate, the Accursed, and the Great Tyrant. They called him the Arrogant One, Ali the Godless, the Profligate, and the Cold-Hearted. He was known as the Despot, the Shedder of Blood, the Notorious Evildoer, and a killer of so many people that only God the Most High could count the numbers. These texts even attribute actions to him that begin to sound like cartoonish villainy. One gruesome account claims his heart was so hardened that he threw a living infant into a mortar and forced the mother to grind her own child while it was still alive, feeding the resulting flesh to his horses. The authors insist his acts of cruelty were so numerous that recording them all in a single volume would be impossible. However, we need to pause here and treat these characterizations with a note of caution. It is entirely possible that Ali was exactly as ruthless and bloodthirsty as they say. History is full of kings like this, and it isn't hard to see why. Recent research suggests that up to 20% of people in the upper echelons of the corporate business world today exhibit signs of psychopathy, compared to just 1 in 100 in the general population. Since violence was the key to power in the Middle Ages, there is no reason to believe this ratio would be any lower among medieval kings. But to give Sunni Ali some credit, it is worth noting that these chronicles were written after his death on the orders of kings who were trying to legitimize their own line of succession. A major part of their strategy was to trash Sunni Ali's reputation. We must always bear in mind that these records were political tools, essentially early propaganda for a new regime. In reality, Sunni Ali occasionally understood the value of mercy. He ordered conquered tribes to join his ranks rather than destroying them, swelling his numbers until the Songhai kingdom commanded a force of 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. Whatever else we might say about him, it is clear that Sunni Ali was a complicated man. Some historians have even questioned whether he suffered from a personality disorder, but at the very least, the violence of this king appears to have stemmed from deep-seated insecurities. Chief among these seems to have been a hatred and distrust of scholars and their learning. It isn't exactly clear why Ali felt this way. Perhaps, like some politicians today, He cultivated a kind of anti-elitist populism that held knowledge and expertise in contempt. There were many rumors circulating that he was not truly a Muslim and only paid lip service to the religion, and perhaps he viewed these scholarly communities as the source of those rumors. Or, quite simply, it's possible he couldn't read and hated those who could. Whatever the reason, the effects were the same, and they would come to a bloody fruition when Ali set his sights on perhaps the greatest prize in all of West Africa, the capital of scholars, the heart of learning, and the city of eternal libraries known as Timbuktu. In the European imagination, Timbuktu is an ancient city. The name has effectively evolved into a synonym for remoteness. When people say they are going all the way to Timbuktu, they essentially mean the farthest point imaginable. Actually, a 2006 survey revealed that over 30% of British respondents believed the city was purely mythical, existing only in fiction alongside places like Atlantis or El Dorado. In reality, the site began as a seasonal camp situated roughly 15 kilometers north of the Niger River. It served as a hub where desert traders arrived to swap salt, gold, ivory, and enslaved people. According to local folklore, this outpost developed around a well belonging to an elderly enslaved woman named Buktu. Consequently, the location was dubbed Timbuktu, or the place of Buktu. By the year 1100, the camp had evolved into a permanent town. Later, under the dominion of the Mali Empire, the population swelled to exceed 100,000 residents. That figure is twice the current population and ranked it among West Africa's most massive urban centers at the time. During its peak, the city hosted Arab, Italian, and Jewish merchants, generating immense riches by taxing about 10% of all merchandise flowing through the market. This prosperity funded a stunning explosion of culture, particularly regarding literacy. The local climate provided ideal conditions for creating and preserving manuscripts. Scribes wrote on tree bark, sheepskins, and paper shipped in from Italy, while the arid desert atmosphere prevented the pages from warping or cracking. Texts were composed here in Arabic, as well as numerous African languages such as Songhai and Fulani. Some pages were even decorated with gold leaf, resulting in incredible works of art. The people of Timbuktu viewed these volumes as emblems of authority and affluence, sparking a vigorous trade in literature with the broader Islamic world. Over the centuries, hundreds of thousands of texts accumulated there. While the city of Gao served as the administrative heart of West Africa, Timbuktu functioned as its intellectual brain. If Gao was the heart of the Sahel, Timbuktu was surely its mind. This was the center of learning that the ruthless Sunni Ali targeted in 1468. Known for his disdain for books, the Conqueror marched on the city. Sunni Ali made his hostile plans for Timbuktu widely known. Before his army arrived, he dispatched a herald to issue a terrifying ultimatum to the citizens. The medieval chronicle, the Tariq al-Fadash describes the scene vividly. The messenger appeared at noon, beating a drum to draw a crowd. He drew a sword, held it up by the hilt, and announced that it was the king's weapon, and he had orders to slaughter anyone found remaining in the town after dark. Panic ensued instantly. The entire population fled so quickly that some left their dinners uneaten and others forgot their sleeping blankets. Before the sun set, Timbuktu was entirely abandoned, with many fleeing homeowners failing to even shut their doors. Following the exodus, Ali seized the city with ease, showing zero mercy to the scholarly community residing there. He commanded his troops to confiscate every book they could find and incinerate them in massive bonfires. Fortunately, fleeing families and academics managed to carry some of their libraries with them, preserving a portion of this ancient wisdom. Others concealed their manuscripts in secret caches, but Sunni Ali executed every scholar who had stayed behind. This episode highlights a moment where Ali's brutality appeared pointless. There was no strategic advantage to persecuting these intellectuals. The violence likely sprang from deep-seated personality traits that historians can only speculate about. Throughout the final 24 years of his rule, Ali launched at least 5 separate purges against the city, attacking nobility, wrecking schools, burning books, and banishing scholars. Naturally, this fostered intense resentment among the people. The population began crying out for a substitute to this tyrant, and according to the chronicles, that replacement was already amassing influence. His name was Askia Mohammed. Lacking a legitimate royal claim, Mohammed was a warrior and nobleman holding the Songhai title Tandifari *, or Lord of the Mountains. He controlled the red sandstone peaks and rocky hills to the south. This terrain is dominated by the Bandiagara Escarpment, a sheer cliff rising 500 meters and stretching 150 kilometers along the present-day border between Mali and Burkina Faso. This was a harsh frontier teeming with hill tribes and bandits. It was also one of the empire's most militarized zones, standing against the vast territories of the formidable Masi people. Consequently, Askia Mohammed led a massive, combat-tested force. As a high-ranking commander, he understood the Songhai military's mechanics, including its flaws and assets. Records also suggest Askia Mohammed clashed repeatedly with King Sunni Ali. While the specific causes of their disputes remain unclear, the Tariq al-Sudan notes that Mohammed was imprisoned and even sentenced to execution multiple times. The text claims the tyrant spared him due to his great courage and stout heart, while also noting Mohammed's wisdom and prudence prevented harm. They may have argued over military strategy, but everything we know about Mohammed paints a picture of a thoughtful diplomat and shrewd statesman. It is possible he protested the terror tactics Sunni Ali employed, drawing the king's ire as a result. Regardless, Askia Mohammed represented a dangerous mix for King Sunni Ali, a rebellious yet indispensable general quietly positioning himself as a genuine alternative to the despot. Soon enough, he would get his chance. Sunni Ali died in November 1492. The exact circumstances remain a mystery. The Tariq al-Fadash attributes his death to divine intervention, claiming God struck him down for mistreating a holy man, a narrative that warrants immediate suspicion. The Tariq al-Sudan offers a slightly more realistic scenario, stating Ali drowned when a flash flood from the Niger River inundated his camp near Kunu village. While flash floods were, and are a lethal reality on the medieval Niger, such an event would be incredibly unlucky for a monarch. Notably, if historians are correct, Kunu village was located within the mountainous region controlled by the Tandifari Askia Mohammed. Perhaps, after facing multiple death sentences himself, Askia Mohammed finally summoned the courage to do what his rival could not: order an assassination. I find support for this theory in a passing detail from the Tariq al-Fadash which notes that Ali's troops buried him before anyone else knew he was dead. If accurate, they may have been hiding wounds on his corpse. Ali was succeeded by his son Baru. It is unclear if he intended to maintain his father's oppressive methods, but regardless, half the country, sick of Sunni Ali's rule, erupted in open revolt. Noble clans that had fled Timbuktu gathered their own armies and returned home, rallying behind the man who had led the opposition against the tyrant, Askia Mohammed. The rapidity of these events suggests to many historians that this coup had been plotted for a long time, perhaps years. Suspecting the nature of this conspiracy, Sunni Ali's son was resolved to crush this upstart general. Sunni Baru's forces gathered around him, a scene dramatically depicted in the Tariq al-Fadash. His troops encircled him on a mountain range, kicking up dust storms that darkened the sky while the noise of their shouts was deafening, promising blood would flow in torrents. Askia Mohammed assembled his rebel army and advanced on Gao, the capital city. Sunni Baru marched out to meet him at a battlefield named Anfao. Although Baru's army outnumbered the rebels, the king must have felt anxious seeing the experienced general's forces arrayed outside his city. He likely tried to recall the lessons his father had taught him. The conflict would have opened with volleys of arrows and cavalry units harassing and harrying each other's lines, followed by the spearmen engaging in close quarters. Ultimately, when the armies clashed, Askia Mohammed's experience triumphed over Sunni Baru's superior numbers. Realizing the battle was lost, one of Baru's generals threw himself into the Niger River and drowned. From that moment on, Askia Mohammed ruled the 24 tribes of the Songhai. The death of the tyrannical King Sunni Ali in November 1492 occurred during a historical tipping point of immense global importance. Major events were underway around the world. The Catholic monarchs of Spain had enacted a new law expelling all of Spain's Jews. As many as 200,000 were forced to flee, with the Ottoman Sultan sending his grand fleet to escort them safely to his lands. A month prior, Henry VII of England besieged the French port of Boulogne, compelling the French king to sue for peace. On the other side of the world, in the Caribbean islands, just days before Sunni Ali was swept away by the flash flood, a European explorer named Christopher Columbus first set foot on the New World. The Battle of Anfao in 1493, when Askia Mohammed emerged victorious outside the walls of Gao, came just a few months before Columbus set out on his second voyage. For the history of the African continent, this discovery would initiate one of its bleakest chapters. It is not recorded whether news of these developments reached the new king of Songhai, Askia Mohammed, but he had quite enough to occupy him at home. Mohammed had inherited a Songhai territory that had never been larger. By the time he took the throne, Imperial Songhai comprised a broad diversity of ethnic groups including the Fulbe, Soninke, Tuareg, Dogon, Bambara, and Bozo. However, it had also suffered greatly from decades of civil war and attacks by aggressive neighbors. Mohammed immediately set about trying to fix these problems. In response to ongoing external attacks, he became determined to reform the Songhai army and secure the empire's borders. He expanded its powerful cavalry and moved away from the use of slave soldiers and conscripts to create a true professional standing army. Soon after seizing power, he embarked on a series of campaigns that would have impressed even the ferocious Sunni Ali. He announced a legally sanctioned jihad against the Masi people to the south. He marched on their cities, capturing many of them and expanding the empire further. Then, he marched against the desert Tuareg people and seized the salt mines of Tegheza, a land where the salt was so abundant that people built their houses out of salt bricks. Askia Mohammed spread the boundaries of the Songhai Empire until it was the largest territory that Africa had ever seen. But while he shared something of his predecessor's military skill, in many ways Askia Mohammed seems to have been the polar opposite of Sunni Ali. Whereas Ali had only been a conqueror, Mohammed was a diplomat and an administrator. He sought to reconcile the differences of the people in his empire, and the chronicle Tariq al-Sudan speaks especially highly of him. It states that through Askia Mohammed, God the Most High alleviated the Muslims' distress and eased their tribulation. It claims he strove to establish the community of Islam and improve people's lot, befriending scholars and seeking counsel from them regarding the appointments and dismissals he made. It should be remembered that these chronicles are essentially pieces of propaganda for Muhammad's Askia dynasty, but we do see this character in evidence in our other sources too. Muhammad's friendship with scholars is perhaps the thing that so distinctly sets him apart from his predecessor. He made peace with the persecuted scribes and learned men of Timbuktu, bringing banished families back from exile and even maintaining personal friendships with some scribes. Askia Mohammed was also pluralistic and outward-looking. While the chronicles don't mention Sunni Ali doing a single thing outside of the empire's borders, Askia Mohammed brought in a new age of diplomacy. He forged connections that reached right across the Muslim world, and he even made a pilgrimage to Mecca in imitation of that legendary king of Mali, Mansa Musa. But Askia Mohammed added a crucial symbolic twist to his journey. He invited leaders from every single ethnic group within his empire to join the pilgrimage. He even included the Fulbe people, a group that had been persecuted and massacred during the reign of Sunni Ali. This radical inclusivity was the secret weapon behind Askia Mohammed's success in building the new Songhai state. He began to forge a nation that transcended ethnic divisions. Previous powers were merely empires of conquest. In the Ghana Empire, the Soninke people ruled over their neighbors, and in the Mali Empire, the Mande people did the exact same thing. Songhai, however, was a new kind of political experiment. It was a nation-state that embraced all the diverse peoples living within its borders, inspiring a sense of patriotism that rose above tribal loyalties. It was a surprisingly modern concept. Muhammad also succeeded where few Songhai kings had before. He united the two distinct halves of the empire, its heart in Gao and its brain in Timbuktu. He managed to win the loyalty of the Muslim scholars in Timbuktu without ever fully abandoning the traditional magic of his ancestors. By fusing these elements, he built an empire that looked destined to stand the test of time. During his reign, he standardized trade regulations and weights, policed the routes to ensure safety, and established an organized tax system. He partitioned the empire into provinces, appointing a governor for each. He also installed ministers to oversee finance, justice, agriculture, and other government sectors. These reforms ushered in an era of virtually unprecedented peace and prosperity for the region. But this golden age, as all golden ages eventually do, was destined to end. Toward the end of his life, Askia Muhammad went blind. Under West African law, this disability should have disqualified him from ruling, as a king was expected to physically lead his armies into battle. However, the old king seemed reluctant to hand the crown to any of his sons. As his sight failed and he reached the age of 70, he began to rely heavily on his head vizier to enact his will. Rumors swirled that this vizier was manipulating the elderly monarch. Askia Muhammad had 37 sons, and as their father aged, each grew impatient to claim the throne. Eventually, a son named Musa grew tired of waiting. Remembered in the chronicles as an arrogant and foolish young man spoiled by royal luxury, Musa staged a coup. He seized the crown, deposing Askia Muhammad and banishing the blind old man to an island in the middle of the Niger River, a place the texts describe as being infested with mosquitoes and toads. Musa's seizure of power naturally enraged the other brothers, many of whom felt they had a stronger claim. The empire immediately erupted into civil war. Musa killed several of his brothers and nearly 30 of his cousins through battles, assassinations, and executions. However, his reign was short. He died in 1531, just 2 years after stealing the throne. Like Ghana and Mali before it, the Songhai Empire suffered from a lack of clear succession laws. While Askia Muhammad had enacted many legal reforms, he never mustered the political will to fix this fatal flaw. A dark period of usurpation and civil conflict followed. There was, however, one brief glimmer of hope amidst the chaos. About 8 years after the old king was banished, another son named Askia Ishmael seized the throne. He ordered his blind father released from the mosquito-plagued island, allowing the former king to return home to die in peace 1 year later. Yet the instability unleashed by the spoiled Prince Musa could not be contained. Askia Ishmael died under mysterious circumstances, and the crisis of disputed succession rolled on. The next 20 years were marked by constant bloodshed as various claimants to the Askia throne fought and died. Entire generations of young men were fed into this meat grinder, all to satisfy the vanity of princes. Askia Muhammad had built Songhai into a global power, but as often happens with great societies, men were now willing to risk destroying it all to claim it for themselves. The Chronicle Tariq al-Fatash is blunt about the causes of Songhai's decline. It asks what caused the ruin of the state and compelled God to throw it into disorder. The answer, it claims, was the failure to observe God's laws and the injustice of slavery. It cites the arrogance of the elites and the terrible crimes committed as the reason divine punishment descended upon the citizens. As civil wars raged, the country's wealth evaporated. The fighting disrupted the lucrative trade hubs of Jen, Timbuktu, and Gao, destroying the economy. Furthermore, West African armies relied heavily on horses, which had to be imported across the desert from Europe at great cost. With the empire in chaos, the warring princes had only one abundant resource left to trade for these vital animals: people. During this crisis, the volume of the slave trade exploded. Defeated armies were frequently captured and sold, with thousands shipped across the desert to labor in Europe and Arabia. This was a pivotal and tragic moment in the continent's history. The collapse of political stability in Africa's largest empire, coupled with the need to finance constant wars, coincided with the arrival of the first European trading posts. The Portuguese established fortified positions at São Tomé, São Salvador, and along the Moroccan coast. This marked the dawn of the transatlantic slave trade, a system that would dwarf the Saharan trade in both scale and cruelty. Within just 20 years of Askia Mohammed's death, and barely 50 years after Columbus reached the Americas, as many as 250,000 Africans had already been kidnapped and transported to the New World. By the time the trade was abolished in the 19th century, that number would exceed 12 million, with nearly 2 million dying on the voyage alone. The era of constant bloodletting in Songhai finally paused with the reign of a man named Askia Dawood. He appears to have been a shrewd operator who immediately placed his sons in strategic government positions. His ability to stabilize the nation led to a brief return to prosperity, earning him the title of Songhai's second greatest king. But when Dawood took power, he inherited a broken country. It is clear that during the 2 decades of unrest following Askia Mohammed's death, rebel factions had gained strength. Askia Dawood launched numerous campaigns to crush insurgencies and sent cavalry into the mountains to stop banditry, achieving some success. However, any hopes of expanding the borders like his predecessors were dashed by a disastrous failed campaign against the Mossi people, which cost him many commanders. Dawood did embark on public works, establishing the equivalent of public libraries, but stability came at a heavy price. During his long 34-year reign, slavery within the empire increased dramatically. Agriculture had suffered from wars, droughts, and famines, so the traditional system of citizen farming was largely replaced by slave plantations. While slavery had always existed in Songhai under Dawood, it became a true slave state. This shift caused massive social disruption, as communities were terrorized by slave raids, which in turn fueled further political instability. There are even accounts of royal slaves amassing great wealth and power, sometimes wielding more influence in the capital than their masters. Toward the end of Askia Dawood's life, the situation deteriorated further. In 1582, a great plague decimated Timbuktu, and syphilis, brought back from the New World by Europeans, began to ravage the population. With Dawood's death in 1583, Songhai spiraled back into civil war and chaos. The kings who followed ruled for only a few years before being killed or deposed. Simultaneously, drought, famine, and inflation struck the region. A strong Songhai state might have weathered these challenges, but with rival princes fighting for the crown, there was no energy left to help the people. The agricultural system, now dependent on slave labor, began to collapse. Songhai entered its terminal phase. There was no turning back. The final king of Songhai was Askia Ishak II. Little is known about him, and what is known is grim. He seems to have been a competent but merciless ruler, channeling the ruthless energy of Sunni Ali rather than the diplomacy of Askia Mohammed. Chronicles describe him burying enemies alive wrapped in palm frond sacks and beating a lord to death with a knotted belt. This was the king who would preside over the final, dramatic collapse of the Songhai Empire. The unrest in Songhai occurred at the worst possible moment because it coincided with the rise of a new power in the north, the Kingdom of Morocco. Situated across the Mediterranean from Spain and Portugal, Morocco had been growing in confidence. The Saudi dynasty had seized control in 1549, gaining popular support by expelling the Portuguese from coastal forts. In retaliation, Portugal invaded, supremely confident of victory. They sent their king, and almost their entire nobility, to crush the Moroccans at the Battle of Qaisar el-Kebir. The Portuguese, believing themselves superior to the Arab Moroccans, were arrogant. They allowed themselves to be surrounded and utterly defeated. 8,000 Portuguese soldiers were killed and 15,000 captured. The body of King Sebastian was never found, and the Portuguese court was wiped out in a single blow. Portugal was effectively beheaded, leading to a succession crisis that saw them absorbed into a union with Spain for the next 60 years. The Moroccans were ecstatic at defeating their greatest rival, but the war had emptied their treasury. With confidence at an all-time high, they turned their gaze south toward the rich but troubled lands across the Sahara, the lands of salt and gold, the lands of the Songhai. Morocco coveted the Tagheza salt mines, where houses were built from blocks of salt, but they also believed European rumors of a massive gold mine hidden somewhere in Africa. By this time, news of Songhai's internal weakness had leaked. One chronicle describes an escaped royal slave fleeing to Marrakesh and giving the Moroccan king intelligence on Songhai's desperate circumstances and enfeebled power, urging him to invade. Morocco seized the opportunity. They prepared an invasion force led by a Spaniard named Judar Pasha. Born Diego de Guevara, he had been captured as a boy and raised in the Sultan's service, rising to become a shrewd military commander with piercing blue eyes. However, he faced a monumental task. He had to march his army across the Sahara Desert, and the cash-strapped Sultan provided him with meager resources. The force assembled to invade Africa's greatest empire was tiny, barely 4,000 men and 500 light cavalry. They knew that an army of tens of thousands guarded Songhai. But the Moroccans possessed a secret weapon that would tip the scales, a technology the Songhai kings had neglected during their years of civil war: gunpowder. Since its invention in China in the 9th century, gunpowder had transformed warfare. It evolved from siege cannons smashing castle walls to handheld defensive weapons in Germany. By 1475, the matchlock mechanism allowed guns to be fired with a trigger rather than a lit fuse. Around 1520, muskets were developed, heavy firearms capable of piercing armor. This technology had ended the age of the armored knight in Europe. Although Judar Pasha had only 4,000 men, most were musketeers, including Spanish mercenaries, and he brought 8 English cannons. The expedition left Marrakesh in November 1590 to take advantage of the cooler winter months. The crossing was slow and grueling. Troops hauled heavy cannons, armor, and supplies across the sands. Many died along the way. It took 4 months, twice the usual time, but in February they arrived on the banks of the Niger River, dusty, exhausted, and few in number. From there they marched on Gao. Navigating the swampy, mosquito-infested floodplains took another month, with many soldiers contracting malaria or sleeping sickness. Finally, the red dunes of Gao appeared on the horizon. Outside the city, at a place called Tondibi, they saw the vast Songhai army marching out to meet them. The sight must have been awe-inspiring. Estimates vary, but Askia Ishak II had likely gathered over 40,000 men, perhaps as many as 80,000. Imagine the sound of a modern sports stadium filled with people. That was the roar of the Songhai army. The ground would have shaken from the footsteps of thousands of infantry and the hooves of cavalry. They were accompanied by drummers, musicians, and thousands of archers. It was the last time an African empire would ever field a force of this magnitude. In contrast, the Moroccan line looked thin and scattered as they positioned themselves on a low hill and readied their muskets. Despite their overwhelming numbers, the Songhai tactics failed immediately. They had heard rumors of the enemy's wonder weapons and devised a plan to neutralize them. But the tactical genius of Sunni Ali and Askia Mohammed was long gone. The Songhai plan began by stampeding 1,000 cattle toward the Moroccan lines, hoping to absorb musket fire and panic the foreigners. Then, the heavy cavalry would charge. However, when the Moroccans fired their cannons, the noise terrified the cattle. The herd stampeded backward, trampling the Songhai soldiers and killing many. Despite this disaster, the Songhai infantry advanced, but they fared no better. From the high ground, puffs of smoke erupted from the Moroccan muskets long before the sound of the shots reached the Songhai lines. Lead pellets whizzed through the air, piercing armor and flesh, mowing down hundreds in a single volley. The chronicle recalls that smoke engulfed the combatants and God sowed fear and dread into the ranks of the Songhai army. Panic set in. King Ishak ordered a desperate cavalry charge, but it was doomed. The thick breastplates of the Songhai horsemen were easily punctured by musket balls, and their horses, terrified by the explosions, fled. The archers were cut down before they could get in range. Soon, they too fled the field. Only the Songhai rearguard stood firm. These were the elite royal bodyguards. Perhaps out of pity or a sense that the massacre was dishonorable, the Moroccans finally drew swords for close combat. The royal bodyguards, surrounded, fought to the last man. One Spanish source records that they bent their knees and tied them together with their belts, anchoring themselves in place to maintain their spear line even as they died. But the effort was futile. The Songhai force was crushed, the king fled, and Judar Pasha's men descended on the helpless city of Gao. They sacked it, looting treasures and burning buildings before moving on to Timbuktu and Jen to do the same. The chronicles express deep sorrow, stating it is beyond their power to describe the misery and losses suffered. The Moroccans tore doors off houses and cut down trees. Horrified by the defeat, the Songhai generals deposed Askia Ishak, and the central state collapsed. Morocco attempted to build an empire in West Africa, but maintaining control across the Sahara proved impossible. Instead, they looted everything they could carry. Leading scholars from Timbuktu were sent to Marrakesh in chains as hostages. Judar Pasha returned to Morocco in 1599, 9 years after leaving, with 30 camel loads of gold. The fall of Imperial Songhai was sudden and total. The complete dissolution happened only 8 years after the death of Askia Dawood. The defeat at Tondibi popped the bubble of empire. Just as with Ghana and Mali, the unified state shattered into countless small kingdoms that reasserted their independence. West Africa cracked like an egg, splintering into smaller and smaller territories. This fragmentation meant there was no unified resistance against the encroaching European colonial powers. As these splinter states warred among themselves, they sold captured enemies into slavery, boosting the trade to industrial levels. Predatory Europeans established posts along the coast, profiting from the chaos, and the full horror of the transatlantic slave trade began to drain Africa's manpower. The dream of rebuilding the glory of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai evaporated. Timbuktu's economy collapsed, and with it, its status as a center of learning. The chronicler Al-Sadi lamented, "I have witnessed the ruin of learning and its utter collapse." This sorrow inspired him to write his history, hoping to teach future generations about their ancestors and the fragility of greatness. As wars raged between the splinter states, Timbuktu was repeatedly besieged. Scholars were kidnapped and sold into slavery in the New World. Libraries gathered dust, and manuscripts became hidden heirlooms, protected by families at great personal risk. Thanks to these custodians and the dry desert air, the great chronicles survived. Meanwhile, the capital city of Gao faded into obscurity. Trees grew in the cracks of its walls, the great mosque crumbled, and the population dwindled to a few hundred families living among ruins overgrown with thorns. But the cycle of history continued. The fractured states of West Africa were eventually folded into the empires of France, Britain, and Portugal. These powers extracted resources until the cycle turned again, and independence movements in the 1950s and 60s dismantled the European empires. If this story teaches us anything, it is that history is constant change. Nothing lasts forever. I want to end with a passage from the Tariq al-Fadash asterisk, the chronicle that has informed so much of this story. This document is a remarkable blend of Islamic scholarship and African spiritual tradition, containing dream visions and prophecies that make it a masterpiece of world literature. One passage recounts Askia Muhammad speaking to a wise man who teaches him to communicate with spirits. These spirits reveal the nation's future. While likely written after the fact as a lament for a lost golden age, it captures the tragedy of the empire's fall. Imagine watching a sophisticated society slide into chaos, libraries closing, mosques crumbling, and sand dunes swallowing the markets, while the songs of the griots still echo in the dusk. In the text, the prince asks the wise man if humans can see spirits. The wise man says yes, and they go into seclusion. The king then describes a terrifying vision. "I see the earth's surface transformed into a lake of water," he says. "I see stars surging out of the water and flying to the heavens. Birds swoop down and cut each other to pieces. Next, I see 7 men placing a green throne between us. An old man leans upon a staff and sits on the throne. The old man in the vision then speaks a prophecy. As a ruler, you will be happy, tolerant, and generous. At the end of your life, you will go blind. You will have many sons, but when you are gone, they will no longer walk the straight path. They will bring devastation to your kingdom. Hearing these words, the prince remained silent for a long moment. Then, he let out a profound sigh, like the moaning of a father who has just lost his son.